Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. In today's episode, we talk to Carey Gillam. Carey is an investigative journalist, a former senior correspondent for Reuters International News Service, and the current research director for consumer group US Right to Know. Now, for the last 20 years, Carey's been covering stories focused on agriculture and on big food business. She's the author of a fascinating new book called Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. And that brings us to today's topic, Monsanto. Now, over the last decade, Monsanto has become a sort of pop cultural boogeyman. It's a company that's faced a lot of controversy around the use and patenting of genetically modified seeds, GMO seeds, and as Carey lays out in her new book, around the deceitful tactics it's used in the past decade to push forward a synthetic pesticide called glyphosate, also known as Roundup. Now in this episode, we cover all of these controversies, but first we look at how Monsanto came to be the agricultural giant that it is today. We talk about the business model that lies behind its commercial success, and also the vital role that Monsanto and other big agribusinesses have played in transforming agriculture. We then finish by digging into the so-called Monsanto Papers, and how they spurred on hundreds of pending lawsuits in the US and triggered a strong backlash in the European Parliament. I really enjoyed this conversation that I had with Carey on what is clearly a fascinating and developing story that concerns the very core of our agricultural system. And so, having said that, and without further preamble, I bring to you Carey Gillam. We have Carey Gillam on the line. Carey, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the world of Monsanto and all the issues that surround the debate there, I think it'd be good for the listeners out there, the ones that are maybe not so familiar with your work, if you could just briefly describe your background and specifically your work in journalism.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. That was never hard. I didn't struggle through college trying to figure out what I wanted to be. I love to, travel and meet people and hear about interesting things going on in the world and share them with other people, right? And help us all kind of come together on important issues that affect us. So I've covered banking and real estate. Through Reuters, I was assigned to a lot of things like Hurricane Katrina coverage and riots in Ferguson, Missouri, and tornadoes and fires and floods. So I've really, had a lot of really interesting experiences. In the 1990s, I was assigned to start covering food and agriculture, and I frankly thought that would be boring, right? I didn't ever think much about, where my food came from or what was involved. I didn't worry about pesticide use. I wasn't concerned about these new GMOs that had just been introduced in the mid-1990s. But this is what Reuters assigned me to do, and I dove in with both feet and started spending a lot of time with Monsanto and Dow and DuPont and Syngenta and the other big players, in the seed and chemical market. Spent a lot of time with farmers, soil scientists, agronomers, seed dealers, grain handling companies. And that's really what I've done for the last 20 years now.
Wow. And it definitely doesn't sound boring, but I can see after looking at a Hurricane Katrina, it might have seemed at first like it wouldn't be. But I mean, definitely Monsanto is a fascinating topic, and I feel like, everyone has an opinion on them. But before we get into the more opinionated parts of what Monsanto is to some people, let's maybe start with just if you could just tell us a little bit about Monsanto's history and how it came to be this agricultural giant that we know it as today.
Yeah, sure. Now, Monsanto didn't start, right, as an agricultural giant, and really that's part of its more recent history. The company, has been a chemical company since its formation in 1901. It was founded in St. Louis. It's actually the headquarters in a little suburb called Creve Coeur, Missouri, part of the St. Louis metro area. They've been involved in a whole lot of different things over the course of their history. Saccharin was one of their early products, the food additive. They've, had business in aspirin, and sulfuric acid, PCBs. They've really been more of an industrial chem company until their more recent history when they got involved in agriculture and started selling herbicide products, and then, of course, their famed genetically engineered seeds that they introduced in the 1990s. And now, it is a pure sort of ag tech and an ag pesticide company, getting ready to merge with Bayer, of course, out of Germany. That should be completed, I think, anytime in the next few weeks. They're looking for that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's definitely something we can touch upon later. Yeah, it's interesting how Monsanto, very much in its origins, and you mentioned PCBs, but also, very much almost from the start, there was a lot of controversy around, its use of PCBs, and then Agent Orange controversies as well around the Vietnam War. And now that it's very much trying to kind of, transition into what it calls itself a life science company, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. They went through a pretty complicated sort of transformation or, facelift overhaul in the late 1990s. They went through this odd deal where they sold themselves to Pharmacia and Upjohn, and then Pharmacia spun off just the ag stuff into what they like to call a new Monsanto. That kind of allowed them to shed some of their PCB liabilities and shove those into a little subsidiary called Solutia, which then went bankrupt. And, so they've reinvented, realigned, and shed off a lot of those old industrial chem liabilities to focus exclusively on, what they do now, the seeds and traits and the chemical sales.
Yeah, from a business perspective, it's pretty incredible what they've achieved. Now, especially, as I understand it, its business model now is very much focused on, Roundup, herbicide, glyphosate on one hand, and then, complemented by Roundup ready GMO seeds on the other. Could you explain a little bit more how, their business model today works and why they're so successful today?
Yeah, definitely. So, right, they got into the herbicide market, 60s and 70s. They introduced glyphosate, which is, the active ingredient in Roundup, and it's the most popular, most widely used herbicidal product in the world. They introduced that in 1974. And, it was, embraced around the world because it killed weeds so effectively and efficiently and was seen as so much safer than other herbicides. But the patent was expiring on that product in 2000 in the United States. And so they, not coincidentally, introduced these seeds that had been genetically altered to be sprayed directly with glyphosate or Roundup, so that the plants wouldn't die. The weeds would, but the corn or soybeans or cotton would stay alive and could thrive. So this was, sort of magical for farmers. They could just go in and spray over the tops of their crops, directly in one fell swoop, and the weeds would die, but the crops wouldn't. It made their jobs a lot easier, and farmers loved it. And Monsanto called these Roundup ready crops. Now, their messaging is not that it's about selling glyphosate or selling Roundup or selling herbicide. That's what they like to say. They like to say, GMO crops are about feeding the world and being, more abundance and environmentally friendly and, all of these things. But internally and to their investors from day one, Monsanto's been saying this is a way to hold on to our market share and boost sales of our herbicides.
Right.
And now, most of the genetically engineered crops planted in the world are designed to be sprayed directly with herbicide. There are other traits. There's an insect-resistant trait, and there is a disease-resistant papaya, and we now have like a non-browning apple, GMO apple. But by far and large, most of the GMOs in the world, when we talk about them, we're talking about spraying them with herbicide.
And another key component really is that these GMO seeds that they designed or engineered, they're connected to intellectual property rights, right? So these seeds are Monsanto's, and so for the business model, the farmers have to buy these seeds on an annual basis.
Right. Yeah. So this is something, I mean, and again, the messaging from the industry is that this is just like what goes on in Mother Nature. It's not any different. We've had, seed evolution throughout all of history. But in fact, the truth is that this is something that never could occur in Mother Nature. It's taking DNA from something outside the species, outside the corn species or the soybean or whatever, and inserting it into the DNA. And because it is so unique, Monsanto's been able to patent those genetic traits that it embeds in these crops. And because it's patented, they're able to require farmers to pay to use it, right? To pay fees to use this technology. So, and what that is translated to is that farmers who buy these seeds, you're right, can't do what they used to do. They can't save seed from their crops and then replant it year after year. They have to buy brand new seed if they want this technology. And again, you're right. I mean, this is it. Monsanto's been bringing in between 13, 14, $15 billion a year in sales every year from these special seeds and traits and their herbicides that go with them. So it's, been a brilliant business model for them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just sticking a little bit more on the business model here. I mean, in one way, just playing the devil's advocate here, you could really say that, given the fact that they have such, heavy research and development, I think I read in one of your articles that it's $2 million a day. So, I mean, it almost provides, I guess, a justification in the same way, I guess, that the pharmaceutical industry justifies its, intellectual property claims, patent claims, by the fact that they have such heavy R&D.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's very much what they say to the farmers. If you want us to provide you with important technology that's useful to you, and if you want us to continue to develop that and bring that to market, we're going to charge you, right? You're going to pay for that. It makes sense. I mean, it's part of capitalism. It's how businesses make money. Monsanto, also licenses its genetic traits to other companies. So they embed those traits in their seeds. So they have, different ways that they bring in money off of this genetic engineering.
I'd like to touch a little bit upon Monsanto's role in the Green Revolution. So often when we talk about the Green Revolution today, at least in modern debates, there's, of course, an enormous focus on a lot of the losses that we've had in terms of soil degradation, in terms of just general environmental losses. But I mean, would it be fair to say that at least at the time, I mean, Monsanto and other companies were very much involved, and that it was almost not an inevitable thing, but very necessary revolution for agriculture?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. It's sort of the father of the Green Revolution. They talk about Norman Borlaug, and this being a really important transition that helped, enhance productivity and the yield of our grain, crops, and improve our, just infrastructure for food production. And that's been incredibly important. Monsanto has sort of embraced that and tried to, I think, tie itself to that association. But, there are many people and a lot of critics that say what Monsanto's doing now, which, has really, they've developed almost a monopoly. I mean, the Department of Justice looked at them on those allegations and those concerns, and Monsanto made some adjustments, not too long ago, but really dominating the seeds, dominating the chemical sphere, and trying to push policies and practices that don't really expand the diversity of our food, but more narrow it. Our seed diversity right now is shrinking. A lot of farmers have a hard time finding sort of native varieties, conventional. It's harder I was talking to a farmer the other day. They were trying to get some organic grain to feed, to their livestock. And it's so difficult for many farmers to do that now. because of the power and the market domination of not just Monsanto, but the other kind of bigger players, DuPont and Dow, BASF and Syngenta, for instance.
Yeah, it's so fascinating this. I mean, especially today when we have this debate around, how to feed 9 billion people by 2050. On the one hand, you very much have this, conversation of Green Revolution 2.0, biotech is the solution. And then on the other extreme, you have people saying, it's only through, agroecology or through permaculture that we're going to reach a solution. And it feels very, polarized at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. And, you and I have talked a little bit about this. I mean, I think there's probably room in the middle somewhere, right? The point of my book, and when I talk to people, is that I do believe that we have gotten so far out of balance with the risk and reward ratio of high tech and pesticide-based agricultural, pesticide-dependent food production. I think we've lost our way a little bit on that, and we are seriously doing damage to our environment and to our health. I mean, I firmly believe that. I don't know that eliminating all pesticides is the answer. I think maybe there is a place for genetic engineering, but I think it's certainly not backed up by the data. And I don't know that it's useful to try to embrace or trumpet the notion that we must have genetically engineered crops and we must spray them with pesticides or people will starve to death. That's just not rational, and it's not backed up by any real data.
Right. Yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more. And just on that point, I think the controversies, I mean, we've stayed away from them a little bit here, but definitely, very much a part of your book, Whitewash, which was a fascinating read, by the way. It felt like I was reading a horror story at times. Yeah. Just so many controversies and a lot going on. But let's talk about that. Maybe let's start with for a lot of people, I think the first thing that comes to mind with Monsanto and controversies is definitely the GMO debate. So let's start there. The controversy around that. I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but I feel to some extent that this is very much a misdirected outrage, that we're glyphosate is much more a culprit than GMOs are. Of course, they're intrinsically interlinked in the case of Monsanto, but where do you stand on this GMO conspiracy or controversy?
Right. Well, ever since GMOs were introduced, obviously, there have been critics, right? There have been people worried and upset that these GMOs are a real threat to human health. And, part of that stems from the fact that the FDA doesn't do any real thorough or independent analysis or require any scrutiny before they're allowed to market. The FDA was convinced early on in a policy decision to treat these as basically equivalent, generally recognized as safe and not different from non-GMO crops on the marketplace. So the companies that bring them out, Monsanto or others, when they roll a new one out to market, they are not required to go through a rigorous safety evaluation by the Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. They do what are called sort of voluntary consultations. They don't have to do them; they're voluntary, but they do generally bring in data and ask the FDA to sign off on it, and then the FDA will issue a letter and say yes or no. Everyone I've ever seen is yes. But they always remind the company, the responsibility for safety is yours. They put that back on the company. So, that sort of inherently did not give people a real good sense, a sense of confidence, I guess, when these came to market. And because they're introducing sort of novel, or DNA that's outside the species, there are concerns about creation of novel proteins and unforeseen allergens. There are concerns that the allergy problems, allergic reactions that people are having could be tied to the GMO foods that they're eating, or there could be other unintended consequences. So that's sort of a real concern and has been. As I was covering this issue and covering the industry, what was most persuasive or concerning to me was the pesticide use. I mean, right. That's I gravitated. That's where I saw the solid science that said, this is a big deal, because the use of glyphosate skyrocketed when the Roundup Ready glyphosate tolerant crops, GMO crops, were introduced. We've gone from 40 million pounds a year, usually, of this weed killer sprayed, in the United States, to close to about 300 million pounds. And it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's been documented in our soil, our water, our rainwater, in our air. It's in bottled water, and it's in our food, and it's in our bodies. If you go get a urine test, you've got glyphosate weed killer in your urine, almost assuredly. And because it's been tied, exposure has been tied to cancer, kidney disease, thyroid disease, a whole array of potential health problems, not to mention the whole array of environmental problems that I lay out in the book. The widespread use of this, the pervasiveness of this, the unchecked use is what I have found to be so concerning. And that has all, of course, been spurred by GMO crop development.
Yeah, and just the fact that, in 2015, the World Health Organization, declared that it was a probable carcinogen. That really sparked the debate again. And I guess this is also why, when it comes to GMOs in Europe, that's why there's such a resistance there too, because it's so intrinsically, I guess, linked to pesticide use and to an increase in pesticide use. And there's been a real backlash, I think, here, especially to the use of GMOs and to the import of GMO crops from the States. Right.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, will any Americans hear this podcast? I was going to say, I think Europeans are just a lot smarter than us. That's probably a dangerous thing to say. But in my travels over there, you just find such a different mindset in terms of food production and protection of natural resources and protection of the fundamental nature of food, which is to nourish us, right, and to be sustaining for our health, not a detriment to our health. I've seen that over and over, and frankly, when I travel in Europe and I eat, I feel better than when I eat here, right? In the United States. And you have a much more precautionary principle over there looking at these things than we do here in the United States. So I think that's definitely been an issue over there. And as I said, I think we've swung so far out of balance over here in the United States. The United States remains the largest user of genetically engineered crops. The most of the GMOs planted and cultivated in the world are in the United States. But glyphosate is not only used on GMOs, of course, it's used in conjunction with more than 70 different food crops, tea and tobacco and array of fruits and vegetables and wheat and oats and barley and lentils and things like that, as well as, the corn and soybeans that we all think about. So it's everywhere.
Yeah, and what's also frightening, and I guess this partly explains the explosion of its use, is it's not just GMOs, but it's the fact that there's this development of super weeds, right?
Yeah, and see, this is the cycle, right? So you create the problem, and then you throw more of it on the problem, and then you exacerbate the problem. So with the rise of glyphosate tied to GMO production, came the rise of superweeds, or weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. And our weed scientists warned the EPA about this. I talk about this in the book, warned the EPA and Monsanto about this when they introduced genetically engineered crops and said, this is going to be a problem. You're going to create resistance in weeds. And weeds are a big deal for farmers, right? If you're not a farmer, you're like, they're ugly, but how big a deal are they?
Harmless.
Right. I mean, they're a big deal to farmers. They take up nutrients and moisture that the crops need, and they really severely can impact production. So farmers need a way to deal with that. And so with this rise of these weeds that wouldn't die, right, anymore, farmers started using 2 or 3 times more glyphosate sometimes or more. And so the weeds became even more resistant. And so now what the chemical industry, Monsanto and the others in the industry have come up with is, well, we'll just combine glyphosate with some older herbicides. We'll combine it with dicamba, for instance, or we'll combine it with 2,4-D, and then we'll spray that over crops that we'll genetically engineer to tolerate all of these herbicides at the same time. And so that's what we're doing now. And, it's not sustainable over the long term. Fighting a pesticide problem with more of the same pesticides. No one really thinks that this is the solution for the long term, but it's the midterm deal, and it's another way to make more billions of dollars for the companies selling these chemicals and seeds.
Mm. But now, I mean, I think this was in your book too, but you're starting to see as well companies like Monsanto as well jumping on, new solutions like these organic pesticide alternatives that are essentially, I forget what they were called, like biopesticides. There we go, biopesticides.
Or biologicals, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's really interesting, and I've been trying to follow that. And you're right, Monsanto and the others have sort of seen the handwriting on the wall and realized that, synthetic pesticides are not maybe the way to go for the long term, or at least that we need some alternatives. And they've been investing research and development dollars into what they call biological platforms, where you're using sort of naturally occurring microbial organisms, found in the soil or in plants or in other things to naturally take care of weeds or insects or disease, things like that. So, and there are a few things out on the market. A lot of them combine sort of the biological with the synthetic, but there are things coming to market. And when I interviewed the head of the EPA pesticide program, Office of Pesticide Programs, he was very excited about that. And the EPA here in the United States has been trying to encourage that. But it's still, nascent, still very early. But there, of course, are organic gardeners and organic farmers who have their own solutions to those things as well. So, but that is something that you're seeing happen, and it's encouraging in the United States. The USDA, separate from that, or maybe working in conjunction with that, I should say, is really trying to encourage farmers as well to reduce their pesticide use and to look at some of these other alternatives, like not only the applications but also just their practices to try to deal with weeds and pests in a more healthy and sustainable way.
Yeah. Yeah, it begs to ask the question then whether we're seeing, the beginning of the end of glyphosate very much in the same way that, PCBs, came and went, DDT, asbestos, these were all, chemicals that were once considered, that were, DDT. I mean, the what was it, the Swiss chemist that discovered its properties, he got a Nobel Prize for it. So, I mean.
Right. Yeah, no. And, that's an interesting idea, the beginning of the end. Certainly, farmers I've interviewed in my book and talk about in the book, and then I talk to, even if they still love glyphosate, and even if they say it doesn't, they don't think it causes cancer or health problems, or they're not worried about it, they do say it doesn't work like it used to. It was great for a while. It's been used. It's been overused. They don't know how long they're going to be able to use it. So even if you don't have any problems with the environmental impacts or the health impacts, if it's not going to work, you got to have an alternative. And so farmers are looking for that. Companies are looking for that. But what the time window is on that, no one knows. Now, the European Union or the European Parliament voted to just go ahead and ban glyphosate, right? They said, we're done with it. France has said they want to ban it. Some other countries in Europe. European Commission has relicensed it for 5 years throughout Europe, and let the member states figure out what they want to do. So, it's different in different countries. So we'll see.
But yeah, in the European Union, just touching, I don't want to let the Europeans off completely here. But I mean, that whole controversy started again because of the Monsanto papers, right? So that was very much in the news. I love that phrase, the Monsanto papers. There's always a papers of something every year.
Right.
But I mean, at the end of the day, despite all the controversy there, and I'd love for you to comment a little bit more about what those papers were about. But despite that, they still won, a narrow win in Parliament. But it's still been extended another 5 years at least.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. The Monsanto papers. Right. So I talk about this in the book. Now the pay, and I have to say, so my book is really built on, thousands of pages of documents. This isn't just my sort of whimsical view of agriculture. This is my investigative journalism, data backed report, which is, I guess from the banking, one of my days covering the banking industry, I became like a fan of data. You can grab onto it, right? And
Right.
it's real.
It's tangible.
It's tangible. It's meaningful. But so what I've done is Freedom of Information Act requests for universities and the EPA, FDA, our federal regulators, and gotten just such wonderful information that they don't like to hand out about how they work with companies like Monsanto and what they've done to help Monsanto and to turn away from, scientific research that shows, ties to disease. And then what has come out in the last couple of years, what you refer to as the Monsanto papers, through lawsuits that have been filed against Monsanto, they've had to turn over in discovery. They estimate roughly 10 million pages of internal documents. And these are emails and, memos and reports and discussions inside this company, inside this very powerful kind of secretive company. And yeah, they've been really eye-opening because when you put those together with the Freedom of Information documents, you see what they say to each other, you see what they say to regulators, and then of course we all know what they say to the public. It's been, well, in my discussion with the European Parliament in October, I said this is decades of deception. These documents prove decades of deceptive tactics by Monsanto to cover up really the evidence of harm tied to this product. And that's what you see. Now, that doesn't say we know it causes cancer. That's for scientists to figure out, right? And our health officials.
Right.
But it's indisputable that this company has spent decades lying to us all.
Wow. And I guess the consequences of that are in the lawsuits that are being filed. And I mean, have there been any up to this point, any real repercussions for Monsanto for those years of deception?
No, I mean, other than, Parliament voting to ban it and for the European Commission saying, well, your license is for 5 years rather than the 15 that you want. But they are facing, there are, about 3,500 people in the United States that have filed lawsuits against Monsanto. They're alleging that they or their family members got non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of exposure to Roundup, and that Monsanto knew about the dangers and hid those dangers. Like that's sort of the basis for all these lawsuits. And there's a pretty important hearing coming up in March in federal court in California, and they're going to go through under sworn testimony. They're going to look at all the science that relates to the health impacts and what Monsanto's hidden or wanted to keep hidden. And that's all going to be talked about in a 5-day court hearing. So that'll be interesting. Monsanto has not wanted that hearing to happen. It was supposed to be in December, and they convinced a judge to delay it. They've tried to get all these lawsuits thrown out, but they haven't been successful. So, we'll see, I guess, how it unfolds.
It's like a never-ending TV show.
They have a history. I think you mentioned in PCBs. They said for a really long time PCBs were safe. They weren't causing any problems. Documents came out in court lawsuits that showed that they knew and hid the dangers of PCBs. We've seen that with DuPont, and some of its chemicals. Also, it seems like it really takes until lawsuits are filed, discovery is served, and internal company documents come out before these secrets are revealed. And it's really sad that this is the way that it is, because so many people can be harmed, over so many decades. But, I'm not saying we know yet the end outcome for Monsanto. I'm just saying seems like a storyline that's played out many times in the tobacco industry and pharmaceutical industry, and certainly in the chemical industry. So,
right.
Something to pay attention to for sure.
Definitely. I thought one more thing in the European Union that was quite funny, but at the same time quite powerful, was the when the members of Parliament, of the European Parliament, the MEP campaign and the let's keep pea glyphosate free. I mean, it's catchy and it is powerful when, I mean, what was it when the results came back? They all, or was it all had glyphosate in their urine?
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about right when the members of parliament decided to, and not all of them did. It was members of the Green Party, I think, that pushed that. But right. Well, let's just see, right? Because I think you feel differently about it when you know it's in your body, right? I mean, It just resonates more strong. I've been tested, my levels are pretty low, but I've been positive for this weed killer too. Now, probably if you test for a lot of other things, I think we're all told we have C8 in our body as well, the deadly chemical that DuPont is paying out hundreds of millions of dollars for contaminating our world with now. But
oh God,
it's not appetizing to think about all of these chemicals and pesticides, right, that are so pervasive now in our world.
Yeah, and it's so true what you point out, that when it becomes personal, I mean, when I was reading your book, I thought the same. First, I thought, okay, I eat mostly organic. I live in Europe. This probably doesn't affect me. This is not something. But then, when you start realizing that, this goes beyond farms. This is in the parks. This is, this is sprayed on the side of roads to keep, weeds at bay. Then you realize it's in our air, like you said. Then you really realize this is everyone's problem, and it concerns
definitely.
everyone.
Well, and people, here in the United States, for sure, and I believe there in Europe, they've been doing the same thing, are reaching out in many cases to their school districts or their cities or townships and saying, we don't spray this in our parks anymore. We don't want this on our playgrounds. We don't want it in the grasses where our children are rolling around and kicking and chasing balls. And because it's absorbed through your skin. It gets into your bloodstream. It's not a good thing. So, if the trade-off is a few dandelions, a lot of people are saying, we'll take the dandelions. I mean, but the point of my book, I guess, is, what I've said is I'm not telling people what to do. I'm trying to share information. Because I think that the rewards, the companies that sell these chemicals, they tout the rewards. They've got a big megaphone. But when you try to weigh that against the risks, a lot of times it's harder to understand or get information about the risks, right? Because these chemical companies work pretty hard to try to hide those. So that's the focus of my work, I guess, is to bring balance to the debate.
Yeah, I really appreciate it too. I think it's very necessary, like we were saying earlier before the podcast when we were talking, to have a bit more nuance and to let people decide, but to make sure that the information's publicly available. Just one before I forget. One important point as well, I think, that we haven't touched upon is, and very much maybe a spanner in the works here, is the Bayer takeover, right? Is the acquisition of Monsanto. Could you comment a little on that?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's supposed to go through any day. Monsanto and Bayer had thought that this would be a done deal by now. It's essentially Bayer, taking over Monsanto, the big German company. And, it's been worrisome to a lot of people because this is just further consolidation in an already pretty consolidated market, right, with for seeds and chemicals. And when you have just a handful of really big, powerful companies that control the marketplace, that could mean, that likely means fewer choices, maybe higher prices, just more market control. And there have been farmer groups, organizations, environmental groups, consumer groups around the world who have pushed back and tried to oppose the Bayer-Monsanto merger, but it all certainly looks like it's going to be a go. The European Commission, has pushed back on this to a certain extent and said that they wanted to evaluate it more thoroughly. So it's been delayed, but I don't know that anybody honestly thinks it's going to get scuttled at this point. It's noteworthy, I know you know this, that it was the German, Bayer's based in Germany, it was the German ag minister that cast sort of the deciding vote in sort of a last minute, very controversial move to allow glyphosate the relicensing for 5 years. So, that there's a lot of scrutiny and skepticism over what motivated him to do that, because Germany had said it was going to abstain from the vote.
It's all very interesting.
Very interesting. A lot of powerful people working behind the scenes in this industry, for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, and I feel a little bit sometimes like we're just spectators to this horror show on the sidelines. And I think that kind of brings me to my last point, which is, what do we do as consumers with, how do we get involved, or how do we, are protests enough? Are there ways that people can, make a difference here in what seems like just this enormous game show?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I've seen that happen, right? So some people want to go and march, right? Want to go to Washington, D.C. or go to Brussels and speak out and engage with lawmakers and regulators and really want to push it that way. Others, maybe it comes down to, they just want to go buy organic food and protect their families. And that way, more people are, I see, searching out, sort of local farmers markets, or maybe trying to grow some of their own fruits and vegetables. Others, maybe it just means like going down to your local city council meeting and saying, we don't, getting a group of neighbors, we don't want this sprayed in our park, or we don't want this in our neighborhood. Or maybe you just don't buy Roundup and spray it on your garden anymore. It all comes, I think it's personal choice, it's personal engagement. And then there are people who are going to say, you know what, pesticides in my food, pesticides in my parks are not something I care about, and that's personal choice too, right? So, right. But you can't begin unless you have information.
Exactly. So everyone should begin by reading your book.
Thank you. Yeah, or following me on Twitter. I put a lot of things up there. Or, I work for this group now, U.S. Right to Know. It's a consumer voice, a consumer advocacy group, really just for information. We just file a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests and get a lot of documents and try to share those with the public.
That's fantastic. That's good journalist work.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and back to data, a lot of data to look at. So
back to your banking roots. I
appreciate what you're doing, though. I appreciate what you're doing. I think this is a great idea to have discussions like this, bringing information to people about our food. We all eat, right? We're all affected.
We do indeed. We all tend to have an opinion on it. No, I very much appreciate your time, Carey, coming onto the show today. Is there maybe a last word you want to say? And also, please tell us your Twitter handle and these other places that you mentioned where people can find your work.
Sure. Twitter is pretty easy. It's Carey Gillam, CareyGillam. I also have a website, careygillam.com, and then US Right to Know, usrtk.org is our website. But I guess my message is, I already alluded to it. I just encourage people in this day and age, it is our health. It's the health of our children. It's the future of our environment. There are a lot of big, powerful forces making a lot of money off products that aren't good for our health or our environment. And it's up to us to educate ourselves and make smart choices, about how we want to protect ourselves. So education, information, and engagement are really the key things, I think.
I couldn't agree more. Carey, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
As Carey already mentioned, if you're interested in staying informed on these issues, you can follow her on Twitter, you can check out her website, and you can check out the US Right to Know website. I'd also highly recommend, as already mentioned, her book, Whitewash, and a few other articles on Monsanto and glyphosate that you can find with all the other information, as always, in the show notes below. Okay, well, that's it for this week. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can also recommend the show to friends and family, and follow us on all of our social media platforms. That's on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handles for all of those platforms are For Food's Sake Me. You can also stream all of the episodes live from the website at forfoodsake.me. And of course, like all podcasts, you can stream them and download them via any podcast app. That's all for now, guys. I'll see you next time.